How do I? All right. Yeah, you're live. Shit, sorry for all the shaking. The CIA is trying to stop us from having the stream, apparently.
We were just having a chill Sunday, and it still feels like we're in shock right now. We're still alright, cool, we got the screen up. It still feels like this is a really bad dream that we just woke up from. So again, we're talking about Evo Morales and the coup in Bolivia. Can y'all see us and hear us okay? Please let us say yes if you can see and hear us okay. If you can in the chat, we greatly appreciate that. Just write yes.
It's working.
If you hear us,
yay.
Yes, okay? Cool. Alrighty. But yeah, so I was laying in bed. I was taking a nap earlier, and Ophelia, she was in the kitchen, and I heard her say that it will step down. You know, obviously the context of the protests and stuff. So we decided to go live and just talk to y'all about this because we have a major role to play here. You know, we can't just sit back and let this happen. So, you know, this is why we decided to start the live.
Sorry, I was fixing the camera, so that's probably why you couldn't see me. Can folks see both of us now? Yeah, it was really shocking. It just came kind of obviously the right wing, they have been out in the street for a couple of days now since the election, which was on the 10th?
Mm-hmm. It was on the 19th.
Oh, sorry, the 19th, which was on the 19th, I believe. And the question was not whether Evo Morales had won the election. He won. It was whether or not the margin was significant enough for him to avoid a second round. And so the Bolivian constitution determines that you can either get a simple majority outright and avoid a second turn, or get at least 40% of the votes and a 10% lead over your opposing candidate. And that's, you know, that small amount of votes, essentially why the National Electoral Council of Bolivia stopped the count during the election, is because there was tons of rural areas where their votes were coming into the capital, in La Paz, and it took several hours, right? Because of some of the road conditions in Bolivia and just how mountainous the country is, it takes a long time to get those votes tallied. And of course, most of those folks are indigenous campesinos out in the periphery, and those were the 500,000. It's not a small margin, right? It's a small margin percentage-wise, but in terms of votes, Evo won the election by 500,000 voters in Bolivia, right? So like that's the difference. That's the difference, and that's what, you know, since the National Electoral Council of Bolivia then authenticated the votes, certified the election, and said that Evo had won the presidency, that's when all hell broke loose. That's when, you know, Mesa and the right-wing candidates in Bolivia started calling everyone out to the streets, started, you know, very much in the same way it plays out in Nicaragua, it plays out in Venezuela, right? Asking for people to burn down public institutions, literally cause enough public chaos, tyranny, and violence, so that the majority of indigenous Bolivians that elected Evo would be so scared that, you know, what has happened would happen. And Evo actually this morning called for elections, right? The second term. He said, okay, you know, we'll give you the right to that. We'll be able to, you know, have that second round of elections because, you know, they're confident that they're still going to win, even though they had already won the election. And they said, no, we're not gonna participate. Just like in Venezuela, we're not gonna participate. We're not gonna be in the elections because they lose elections. They've lost elections for 13 years, not just for the presidency, but literally for every seat in their congressional body, right? And maybe Ramiro can explain a little bit about how it functions. Yeah. And if you caught our video that Ramiro made for Decolonizing Media recently on Bolivia, he kind of explains the structure. You know, it's very similar to here, right, where there's like a lower house and an upper house. And in any case, MAS has a majority of the seats in both of those governing institutions. And what has just happened about 2 hours ago is that President Evo Morales tweeted and shared out his resignation. Mind you, he's still sitting president until January. And he decided to do so after, under the threat and duress of a military coup, where the armed forces and the national police turned against the people. So it's a lot of things happening. Currently, there's a lot of disinformation, there's a lot of news that we can't verify, but what we do know is certain is that they are burning public institutions, they're beating indigenous people in the streets. Whether or not they supported Evo Morales doesn't matter, right? Just like the Guarimeros beat and murder black folks in Venezuela, whether or not they're Chavista doesn't matter, right? And it's this like vehement, racist, fascist right wing that kind of wants to do as it pleases with Bolivia and the tremendous amount of progress it's made in the past 13 years.
It's really, as someone was mentioning, I'm just taking a look at the chat. They said, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe this is happening either. It's interesting because as communists, we understand the limits of bourgeois democracy. And in this sense, in general, with the pink tide in Latin America, there was an adherence to electoral politics, dialogue with the opposition, which as communists, we understand that it's very limited, and that doesn't allow you to retain state power, dictatorship of the proletariat over things like the armed forces, because if Bolivia had been structured in a more Marxist-Leninist style, in the way that China, Soviet Union, where it's like this kind of thing wouldn't be as easy to pull off. That said, however, I do want to make very clear that our role as communists in the first world, in the US, in the UK, Canada, and the countries that are financing the opposition in Bolivia, our role is not to say, oh, you see, this is why you fucked up because of bourgeois democracy. That's the ultra-left anarchist position. Our role as principled communists in the first world is to oppose from within the US and imperialist role. This is for the Bolivian people to decide for themselves what course of action they're taking. And they are taking revolutionary courses of action, because if you look at it, we just heard a statement a few minutes ago that was put out by MAS, Movimiento al Socialismo, the Evo's party, that had a very beautiful statement talking about how indigenous people have resisted conquest for hundreds of years. This is nothing new. This is a new stage of the struggle, continuing against la conquista, against imperialism, against colonialism. And so they know what they're doing, right? So our role isn't just to critique them, but we have to support them.
So a question from the redistributor: should there be a creation of an armed militia to bring Bolivia's president back to power?
Definitely. I think any armed militia, the communities have to be, and also Nicolás Maduro was talking about it too.
And I think that's one of the kind of institutional differences, right, between Bolivia and Venezuela, right? And that's that Bolivia had someone like Chavez, who was a military commander, who began like really a movement of a traditionally right-wing institution in most Latin American countries, which is the armed forces, and really like just eradicated a lot of that pro-imperialist, pro-US sentiment within the country, and did a lot of work to create the cívico-militar partnership, right? And that's what you'll hear them reference that a lot. And in Bolivia, we do have a lot of the higher officers and commanders in training were trained at like OAS schools, were trained in like the US, have conduits and ties to the State Department, to you name it. And so I think it's not surprising to see that the armed forces has put something like that out, the national police. But I would say, and much like a lot of other folks are saying, it's still too soon to tell. It's still too soon to tell like exactly what's going to happen. Never forget that when Chavez was abducted, right? He was gone for like 2-3 days,
yeah. And
it wasn't until the people clamored in the streets that he was able to come back. Evo Morales, from what we've heard and have confirmed, is out in Cochabamba, which is also one of the strongholds of MAS and of President Morales. So we're hopeful that something can happen from there, and that the people are on the streets defending themselves. But there is widespread and rampant violence. They're shutting down alternative media institutions. They're shutting down hospitals. They already launched an attack on the Venezuelan embassy, for example, through dynamite, tried to blow it up. They have a preemptive order of arrest for Evo Morales. Like, what the fuck? So first you wanted him to step down, right? He steps down, and all of a sudden now he's a criminal. For what exactly? And all of this is, they're grounding themselves institutionally in the Organization of American States, which is, you know, a fucking imperialist bullshit organization that not even every Latin American or Caribbean country is a part of. And because the OAS has determined that the elections are claiming that they're fraudulent, they've taken, you know, this statement from the OAS as grounds to not only arrest several heads of the party, Movimiento al Socialismo más, but also sitting and elected representatives of government, including President Morales and the vice president of the country. And also the head of the Senate has also resigned and stepped down. And a lot of this is happening under duress, right? Under threats of, we're gonna like rape and murder your family, like we're gonna kill you if you don't step down. And so that's part of what Evo said in his message when he was resigning, that, you know, he did it to protect people, right? He did it to ensure that the right wing was not gonna be violent. But, you know, I don't know if that was just like, you know, a tactical thing, and I really sincerely hope that it is, because to me it's just like the guarimbeiros in Venezuela, like, and like, you know, the redistributor is mentioning, like, the only way these, you know, fascist forces are going to be quelled or stepped down is by a response from the people. That's what happened in Nicaragua, right, with the civilian militias, and that's what happened in Venezuela as well. And Venezuela has given more thought and funding to the civilian militias, and is training more civilian militias in the country, giving weapons to the people.
And there's some really dark forces that are behind this protest. I just want to go to a few quick questions. When is the next, Kevin Regalado said, when is the next election in Bolivia? 2024, but as Ofelia was mentioning, Evo is still the president until January. Nubian McCarthy asked, do you think this coup will be similar in any way to the 2002 coup in Venezuela? There are a lot of similarities, but at this point, it's too early to tell exactly what is going to happen. So we still need to see what will happen. But I think one thing I will say is the fight is definitely not over. Evo wrote the letter and stepped down. And he admitted himself, which is a little different from the coup in Honduras in 2009, where they just fabricated a letter. But I think,
and with Chavez.
And with Chavez as well.
So in both of those instances, they said both Zelaya and Chavez had stepped down, had written a letter. Of course, nobody was able to communicate with them, right? Because they were abducted and taken to, like, well, no one knew where they were. But this is different, where he himself has stepped down, which I think is, you know, part of like the kind of differences we're talking about between, you know, Venezuela and here and Bolivia currently. And I think somebody asked Orlando, what ripple effect will happen to current leftist movements and groups across Latin America? Well, and thanks for asking that question, because it gets exactly into a little bit of the context, the relevance and significance that Bolivia has. And it's not just that they're building an expansive, you know, movement towards socialism in a majority indigenous country, which is monumental in and of itself. They also hold a ton of rare earth minerals that's very important for technology and space development. Like if you caught the decolonizing media video on Bolivia, Ramiro explained a little bit more about Bolivia forging alliances with Russia and China to develop space programs, to develop lithium extraction in the country. So there's a lot that the U.S. is interested in Bolivia specifically, you know, to exploit and to extract the natural resources of the country. But on top of that, it's as I was mentioning to Ramiro when we're watching some of the coverage on Telesur and RT and different sources, right? The U.S. is at a point where it's trying to reconsolidate, right? Because Lula was just released in Brazil. You have massive protests in Ecuador and Chile, and Chile is still going strong, and we're 100% behind the people in Chile. And then Argentina, right? You had, and then Colombia, even Colombia, which is you know, a very like staunch, you know, right-wing stronghold for the U.S. Just elected like a lesbian, you know, mayor for the first time in Bogotá, which is in a very important area. Some non-traditional parties also gained some seats in the assembly. So there's a lot. Honduras, right, Haiti, which have literally been protesting, I feel, the entire year, right? Because they're sick of neoliberalism. You have AMLO in Mexico, you have Ortega in Nicaragua, and so the U.S. is shitting themselves. And I think that's why the reaction in Bolivia has been that much more, just that much more violent, right? Like it's
There's the expression that a rat becomes more violent when it's cornered and when it feels that it's about to die. And I think that's the analogy we should take with US imperialism and neoliberalism. Because what we have is a situation where you have US imperialism trying to overthrow countries that have an independent economy, whether it's socialist or not, like Bolivia, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela. The US imperialism is trying to gain hold of those markets because capitalism is based on constant expansion. If US companies don't enter the Bolivian market, if they don't enter the Venezuelan market, if they don't enter the Nicaraguan market, US companies will fail. And so capitalism, as an unstable system, is constantly trying to expand into new markets. And at the same time, however, in the markets where it's already well established, it's literally self-cannibalizing and eating itself from the inside. Take a look at Honduras, Haiti, Chile, Colombia, countries that are under and have been under neoliberalism for a lot of time, under capitalism, and poverty is going up, malnutrition, life expectancy is going down, and so it's spreading. The US as this corrupt, violent, racist, capitalist, imperialist system is expanding. It's also simultaneously dying from within, and its latest target, Bolivia, is trying to escape that. And this is what unfortunately, a lot of first world leftists don't get, is that when you're a country in the third world that has historically been one of the poorest in the world, think about it, Bolivia, for a long time was the second or third poorest country in Latin America after Haiti, and Honduras recently has become poorer than than Bolivia, but historically, Bolivia has been a very impoverished country in the global south because a white settler minority, the criollos, have sold the natural resources to foreign corporations that need things like lithium, like salt, like iron ore.
And copper, which is another thing that, if you know a little bit about Bolivia, and I don't want to keep saying Venezuela, but if you know a little bit about Bolivia, and it historically had access to the Pacific coast, to the sea. But under, these criollo governments, they allowed Chile to take their access, not only their access to the sea, but also valuable and already known copper reserves in the country. So that was like something that crippled Bolivia for a very long time, because it's very, as we know, copper is a very valuable metal and resource. And that's something that, is an ongoing issue, of course, between Bolivia and Chile as well. And someone has asked Rodolfo, hey Rodolfo, what's up? Where should Evo seek refuge? Honestly, like we were mentioning earlier, I don't think he's gone anywhere, and it's strategic. I think that, maybe he's, trying to plan something from where he is now, trying to see like where his bases are, where his strength is, and I really hope he doesn't leave the country. Obviously, like, if they're like, now the conservative candidate, not Mesa, the other one, put out a tweet saying that, well, they're looking for Evo, they're looking for his preemptive arrest, they're looking, which is just, it's insane. It's insane how they moved from, oh, these elections are fraudulent, to Evo's a criminal, right? And that's kind of what happens in these situations. They're not really about elections. They're not really about, quote unquote, bourgeois democracy. It's about getting rid of our leadership, getting rid of a figure that means so much to the indigenous socialist movement in Bolivia. And so Mexico has already offered him asylum, as someone mentioned in the chat. So I think that is historic, right? Like that is monumental to have Mexico, which was run for 70 years by right-wing neoliberal governments, respect the sovereignty, and not just respect the sovereignty, but put their money where their mouth is, in essence. And they've already offered asylum to about 20, I think, ish. Yeah. I can't confirm the exact number, but there's a myriad of reports coming in right now. But they've already offered asylum.
To Ecuador as well, with
Right, to Ecuador as well during the recent protests. So it's you know, they've been stepping it up a lot in terms of like more integrationist Latin American solidarity, which I think is, it just, well, as a Mexican, makes me very proud. There are, of course, a lot of criticisms we have of AMLO, but at the end of the day, like, this is an essential and an important kind of figure. Mexico, the second largest country in Latin America, to step up in a non-interventionist and condemning imperialism and this coup. And the Minister of Foreign Relations put out a tweet as well saying we condemn this coup against President Evo Morales. So I think that's also a refreshing kind of thing to see, even within all this, you know, a little bit of, you know, silver lining that we're starting to see Mexico take more of that role in recent protests.
And it's important to take a look at, step away from just the individuals for a second, because a lot of the attention is just Evo, Evo, Evo. I love Evo, and I think he's great, but it's important to mention that this is more than just a struggle between individuals. This is a struggle between classes. As someone mentioned in the chat, no war but class war. And in Bolivia, you have one class, the working class, the proletariat of workers and peasants, indigenous, Aymara, Quechua, indigenous people who are the majority, the masses, right? The Bolshevik party was called the majority party, the majoritarian party. And, you know, MAS is representing, although, you know, it has taken a different path toward trying to build socialism, it represents the majority of the people, right? And so you have that class, the oppressed class, and then on the other side, you have the ruling white right-wing settler class that has governed Bolivia for the past over 180 years, since the country got so-called independence in the 1820s. A wealthy white minority of white people, Europeans who are not from there originally, who call the shots. They run the means of production. They decide all the wealth, the lithium, the iron ore. They decide how that money is spent, the multinational companies. And also, keep in mind that in Bolivia, that was home to where a lot of Nazis, after World War II, settled. The Bolivian opposition against Evo is some of the most racist, fascist elements that you could find in Latin America.
Mesa himself was obligated to step down because of a movement Evo Morales led in the country in the early 2000s. I believe we were just hearing on RT because of of an attack he led against indigenous people in the country. Like, just go look up pictures of these guys. They're like fucking white. Like, they're
straight
white.
Out of fucking
they're
Nazi
white
Germany.
men. And another thing that kind of indicates the class nature and the racial nature of these right wingers is that they took down the huipala. So the huipala is that checkered flag that you usually see, and that Evo Morales, as well as MAS, and you know, a majority of the people in the country who are Quechua and who are Aymara in the country, passed a resolution to make that the second official flag of Bolivia. So it's an indigenous flag, and it's like, and then there's like the orange, there's the red, green, yellow flag, the what we traditionally associate with Bolivia, but bringing, you know, a pride to indigeneity, bringing a kind of seriousness and institutionality to like indigenous, you know, history in Bolivia, which is a majority indigenous country, which was unheard of. He made Aymara a second official language in the country, began developing curriculum to support and foment the language. So many of these things, right, that you begin to see how fucking racist and classist and reactionary, right, the protests, you know, really are, which is another name for, you know, right-wing violence against indigenous and working people. And I believe someone in the chat shared that we don't have confirmation of this, but that they have abducted Evo's sister, have set her house on fire. There's a lot of reports of that for other MAS politicians. Someone asked who's taking over in the coup. So obviously, once Evo stepped down, his VP would now take over his mandate. His VP also resigned. The third person in line, very similar to the US, would be the head of the Asamblea Nacional. She has also resigned. So the person who has, and she was extraordinary, I forget her name, but she is like the youngest woman to have ever led the National Assembly, young indigenous woman from I believe she's from Cochabamba.
Yeah.
Who's from Cochabamba. But obviously they've threatened a lot of mass leaders, they've threatened a lot of people in the country, are executing out threats with support of not only obviously the US and the imperialist forces that be, but also with the reactionary Catholic Church in the country. So there's like a lot of elements at play, very similar to Venezuela and Nicaragua. So then that's the person who is now the president of Bolivia, right? Her name is Janine or something like that. So she was the vice president of the National Assembly in the country.
Shout out to my homie Joe the Red, who's watching this. Shout out to Luis Micho, one of my Fiota homies. Thanks for following this and supporting this. Thank you all for being on the stream. I think it's important we talk about it, because literally if you go right now on YouTube and you look up the coverage of what's going on, it's the usual, oh well, we got to tell both sides of the story, you know, and it's framed in the same way that we've seen in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other places where it's like, you know, the pro-democracy protesters fighting for democracy and freedom. And the timing is really interesting too, because what you see a lot of bourgeois media publications doing is framing it within the context of this broader uprising against neoliberalism, right? The protests going on in Chile, the protests that were going on in Ecuador and Haiti. And so they're saying, oh yeah, in Bolivia too. It's like, wait a second, that's a totally different protest.
Oh, it's just
right?
like Hong Kong.
Right, it's like, oh yeah, Hong Kong and Bolivia too, right? No. Those are protests, those are reactionary right-wing fucking imperialist protests. For example, in Hong Kong, you have people waving British flags, US flags, make Hong Kong
singing the American anthem.
British again. And in Bolivia, by them tearing down the Huipala, as Ophelia mentioned, and they're basically subtly hinting at, you know, we don't want these indigenous people in power, we want to exterminate. And you see, there was graffiti in certain parts of Bolivia that would say, fuera indios, fuera Evo, and all kinds of disgusting shit. So this is a class war, this is a race war between an oppressed and the oppressor.
And the mayor of one of the departments, you might have seen this video, I forget exactly what her name was, but they literally paraded her in the street barefoot, cut her hair off, threw red dye all over her, threatened to murder her, harassed her ad nauseum because she refused to speak ill of Mas, to speak ill of Evo Morales, and once she was able to speak to media, she said, you know what, if I have to die, you know, for this movement that we have built here in Bolivia, I will, and I won't let them humiliate me, and I won't let them shame me. And that's, you know, that's the position we see most indigenous Bolivians and the majority of Bolivians taking in the country, that, you know, this is something that we're not going to stand idly by, that it's something that we're proud of, that we reduced extreme poverty, that Bolivia was a country that had like, what, 20% literacy rates in the country, and Evo Morales in 2 fucking years, because Cuba has proven this time and time again, Yo Si Puedo, right, their famous literacy program, that ending literacy is just a question of will. It doesn't even cost you that much, but what it does cost them is the ability to keep indigenous peoples subservient, right, to the ruling white class in the country. So when Evo Morales first assumed his first presidential term, immediately within 2 years eradicated illiteracy in the country. So it's just, you know, this wasn't that long ago. That was 2006, right? And people act like, oh, Evo Morales has been in power forever, 13 years. I'm like, yo, Angela Merkel, how long has she been Chancellor of Germany?
Right.
Really?
She's old as fuck too.
And she's a strong, charismatic, smart leader, right? But when it's our indigenous socialist leaders, all of a sudden we're tyrants. All of a sudden we're dictators. All of a sudden we don't have the right to self-rule. We don't have the maturity, the intelligence to be able to determine what's best for our people and for our countries. And it's just absolutely infuriating. Just the way, even just take a scroll right now on Twitter, take a scroll right now on any news site you're getting. If your IP address is in the US, it's all Evo Morales steps down under accusations of fraud. Evo Morales steps down under da-da-da-da-da. Like, just, you know, the way they frame the story time and time again. And Rodolfo, you asked what is Venezuela's position. Venezuela obviously has come out in full force and strength in support of Evo Morales. President Nicolas Maduro has also shared messages of solidarity and support, and has called out to the people to recognize the right wing and the guarimbas, right? Because he said in Venezuela we're very familiar with these types of attacks and terrorists and fascists. mess around with these people, right? Like they cannot be compromised with, because ultimately what they want is a savage destruction of, you know, the socialism, sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination that we've built over the past, you know, well, in Bolivia's case, 13 years, and in Venezuela's case, about 20 years. So they have called for mass mobilizations in Venezuela as well. And that's something I think that's so beautiful also about Venezuela. It's not just about like, well, we're in trouble and we gotta figure our things out. No, it's like always in solidarity at 100% with the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, and honestly, like oppressed peoples around the world. So when Venezuela has, obviously, he said we can't take half steps and half measures, we gotta call it like it is. I was just listening to the broadcast on Telesur, and he said, yeah, he's like, this is a coup. This is exactly what this is a coup. And just like they tried to kill me, was it about a year ago or 2 years ago with a drone, that was documented even by bourgeois media institutions like the New York Times. They're trying to launch this assault against Evo Morales. And I haven't seen, we obviously jumped off of the broadcast to do this live stream and chat with y'all, but RT and Telesur went back to regular programming, so I'm not sure when.
Yeah.
I'm sure as soon as we have any updates, they're gonna go back straight live to whatever's going on in Bolivia and the country. So if y'all see anything while we're doing the stream, like definitely throw it in the comments.
Yeah, put it in the chat. Let us know if there's anything.
Chat.
I think one thing that best summarizes the racism of the Bolivian opposition, the coup, the golpistas who are taking out the Evo government. One thing that best exemplifies their racism, they had a cartoon, right, of Evo as a child holding on to an airplane, right, a little airplane, a toy airplane, and it was a political cartoon that they drew criticizing his decision to use funds for an airplane to do government business, which is fine. If you're a president, you need a fucking plane to get around, to go to places. And it's not like it's like a luxury jet. It's just a plane that he uses to get from place to place. And so they portrayed him as a child, as a very young child playing with a plane, spending money, right? This racist concept that indigenous people are childlike. And that goes even to eugenics and to this Nazi propaganda that a lot of Nazis actually bought to Bolivia in the eugenics program in Nazi Germany. When they classified the different races of people, they described indigenous people as the childlike species. They also use the same term for people from Asia, what they call the Mongoloids. They said that the Mongoloids were a childlike species who have no ability to reason, who are capricious, who act on impulse. And that's exactly the same kind of message that the Bolivian opposition portrays with Evo, that he's this young childlike idiot who doesn't know what he's doing, who's mismanaging the economy. Yeah, it's the complete opposite. So Orlando said, what kind of political backlash from US to Mexico do you believe to occur for Mexico offering political asylum, sanctions of any kind?
I mean, that's very possible, just like when AMLO was working on the work permit and amnesty for the caravan, the migrant caravans that were traveling throughout Mexico, and that was very disappointing, yeah, that he did rescind some of that, and not only that, but also, increase like the military and the police presence in the area. But, at the end of the day, like, I think AMLO, and I think Mexico in general, in terms of their foreign policy and things of that nature, have, resoundingly stood with principles of Latin American sovereignty and solidarity, and that includes when they were trying to pass, like declarations, the Organization of American States, the UN against Venezuela, with the most recent sanctions that happened in April, I believe. So, Maduro was invited, as were other dignitaries from Venezuela, to AMLO's inauguration. And I think from the very beginning, he has said that he is not interested in continuing the same kind of foreign policy of previous Mexican presidencies, and that's honestly why he was elected. So I don't see the U.S. letting this, kind of slide. but in a sense, like they're using some of their political clout and deciding to spend some of that, energy and time, like to do, to provide political asylum for folks from Bolivia, folks in Ecuador, so on and so forth. And I think that that's great. I think that, of course, you can't do any of this without suffering some type of repercussion. What it is exactly, I'm not sure. I don't think it'll be sanctions. It wasn't even sanctions the last time. Last time what Trump was about to do was impose a importation tax on Mexico. And if you're not aware, Mexico is very dependent since NAFTA on U.S. Goods and products. In fact, they're kind of like the first place, U.S. corn and soy and all of these things go to, besides like China, of course. So they're very dependent on that, and U.S. companies are very dependent on Mexican labor. So their economies are kind of intrinsically tied, and if they were to sanction Mexico, I think that's part of the reason why that hasn't happened. Their economies are too kind of like wrapped up into each other. But someone has just shared also that Maduro. Oh, what are some good news sources? Someone mentioned the Gray Zone, of course, Telesur, of course. There's Bolivia TV. But the troubling thing about the Bolivian media outlets is that they're shutting down those media outlets. Yeah. So we're not really sure if you're going to be able to have access to them, and they're in Spanish as well. So if you don't speak Spanish, you're not going to be able to access them. But there's Resumen English, which is the English side of Resumen Latinoamericano. I'm sure Misión Verdad, they mostly do Venezuela, but I would imagine, I haven't checked. Revolución. Misión Verdad does stuff in English as well, and I think they must have written something on Bolivia already. They're very good, and they're very analytical. They have a lot of good facts.
I think another player in this broader issue, in this incident, this racist and imperialist coup in Bolivia, that is not really talked about a lot is Israel. Israel is extremely against President Evo Morales, not only because of his support and the indigenous support for the people of Palestine who are resisting Zionism, and because Bolivia has been one of the harshest critics of Israel at the UN and has consistently voted against Israel in the UN, but also because Israel has a strong base of evangelicals, not just in Bolivia, but all over Latin America, who are pushing this right-wing, fascist, evangelical, Zionist political trend, which in a lot of parties across Latin America manifests itself within these Christian democratic parties. And so Israel, you have these right-wing evangelicals. In the example of the recent election in Bolivia, Chi Hyung-chun, who was a right-wing South Korean origin pastor, who has visited Israel several times. He's also in that coalition of the opposition. It's not just Carlos Mesa and Comunidad Ciudadana, it's also El Partido Cristiano Demócrata, which is backed by Israel. All of these right-wing evangelical parties get money from Israel, and they propagate these ideas that honoring La Pachamama and indigenous culture and customs is apostasy, that Evo is like the incarnate of the devil. And these right-wing evangelical groups that have taken power in Brazil, for example, under Bolsonaro, who get funding from Israel, who get funding from these Zionists, they're also playing a role in this broader scheme. And another thing to keep in mind is that Bolivia and China are very unique in the sense that both are home to rare earth minerals that are needed for space travel. One of the things that Bolivia and the People's Republic of China were talking about in terms of developing their space program, as you know, they jointly built a space station in Bolivia to study. And one of the main goals of Evo with the space station is to find natural resources in space that can help solve the climate crisis, right? Because there have been studies that have shown that there are elements in space, on the moon and other planets, that could possibly create a sustainable environment without any reliance on oil, on any other expendable resources. That was the kind of stuff that Bolivia under Evo was trying to do to solve the climate crisis. And because they sit on some of the rare earth minerals that the U.S. is so dependent on, they wanted to make sure that doesn't happen, right? Because the U.S. wants to dominate that market. So we also have to look at it in terms of economics, because as communists, as Marxists, we understand that the economics is the base of understanding any particular phenomena that takes place. In this case, the racist imperialist coup in Bolivia. The base is the economics. The base is this failing capitalist economy that the U.S. imperialist system is trying to export all over the world. Coca-Cola, I'll remind you, Coca-Cola was kicked out of Bolivia, Nestle, McDonald's, all these companies want a slice of that market. And they're going to do whatever they can to get into that market, to dominate, because they want countries that are colonies that are dependent on their exports. Bolivia said, nope, we're doing our own shit, we're developing our own industry, we're trading with China and Russia. They're not perfect, but that's the only option in this material world in the 21st century. You have to work with what you have. And that was kind of my issue with a lot of anarchists and ultra-leftists who don't support Bolivia on the grounds of, oh, you know, they're still extracting, they're still doing this and that. But it's like, when you live in this world, in this society, if you're a revolutionary movement, you have to work with what you have. There's no magic wand that allows you to transition to a coal-free economy, you know, free from extractivism overnight. You have to build that. You have to mobilize millions of people. And that's a very, very challenging. We have problems in the US getting 10 people together for a meeting or for an event. Imagine mobilizing millions of people to restructure an entire economy after hundreds of years of settler colonialism. So that's the context that we have to keep in mind when you hear people who are like, you see, this is why. It's like, duh, okay, yeah, we agree with you. We actually share that point of view as well, that these are the things that wouldn't happen under a revolutionary socialist movement, and this is because of bourgeois electoral system. But that's not the point. The point is, how do we turn this moment into a learning moment to radicalize the base? Because now an opening has been created. Now you have millions of indigenous people who are going to defend to the death the gains that they were able to make, and that's how we have to understand it.
And I want to make something very clear, because there are folks sharing that we're being biased because for whatever reason there's violence coming up on both sides. Look, here's the difference. One is self-defense, and two, respecting the dignity and sovereignty of an election that overwhelmingly supported Evo Morales. So if people are out there defending themselves, there's a difference between justified violence in self-defense, right, and in defense of our dignity, of our indigenous dignity, of our sovereignty, versus a very clear white criollo majority that wants to take power in Bolivia to undo 14 years of incredible progress, growth, and respect to indigenous peoples in Bolivia. That is the difference. It's not the same thing. Don't try and pretend like it's the same thing. And if you want us to do that, you're in the wrong place, son. Like, you're just in the wrong place. Yeah. Thank you so much, Caleb, for joining us. Thank you
shout out to Caleb, man.
Caleb, for sharing the live. We're just, you know, it as Rodolfo has pointed out in the chat, it really depends now on Evo's base, and absolutely, I agree with you. I think it depends on how the people are going to respond to this threat to indigenous socialism in Bolivia. And I, for one, have 100% respect and optimism, right? Like, as revolutionaries, as socialists, like, maybe, you know, we have to have that optimism. We have to keep that hope. We have to keep our heads held high. Yeah. Because no matter what happens, these 14-ish, well, 13 and change, right? But these 14 years of Evo Morales, not just Evo Morales, but of indigenous people mobilizing and building their country, is going to be remembered forever, right? Like, and it's not in the past. Like, we're still fighting now in this moment. Like, we can't hang our heads low now, right? Like, we are, you know, so joyful and elated to even share like what Bolivia has accomplished in the past 14 years, right? To be able to give indigenous peoples in an indigenous majority country, you know, like pride in who they are. Like, having an indigenous woman be a broadcaster in Spanish and in Aymara, and you know, all of these things that, you know, you think a right-wing criollo party would ever do something like that? No.
Yeah, like if you turn on Univision, for example, or Telemundo, those are the two main bourgeois Latin American media outlets.
Here.
Almost all the people are white, they're wealthy, they're in Miami. That's who the Bolivian opposition represents. They represent the wealthy imperialist capitalist class, white class in Bolivia that are opposed to the indigenous majority. Because again, it ties back to their view. They fundamentally view indigenous people as an inferior species. Because the Nazis, as I mentioned, they left Germany, and a lot of them went to Bolivia, a lot of them went to Argentina during Operation Condor. During Operation Condor, the evangelicals and the US-backed right wing, which is the opposition now, they were the ones who were pointing out indigenous activists, killing them in mass. There was entire massacres in Bolivia during the 20th century against indigenous socialists because they were trying to take back their lands, defend their lands from literal Nazis. And so what I find interesting is that this is the perfect time to put to the test all of these so-called radical anti-fascists and anarchists in the US who, you know, they love taking pictures of like indigeneity, which is cool. We love that. We love indigenous, you know, promoting art and, you know, pictures of indigenous people. But now is the time where concrete action has to be taken. So if you claim that you're against fascism, if you claim that you're in favor of indigenous liberation, now's the time. You have an indigenous socialist leader who's under attack, who's in hiding. You have indigenous masses who are under attack by fascists in the streets of Bolivia. This is now. This is the time to show what you're really about. If you really care about defeating fascists, if you really care about liberating indigenous people, support Bolivia, support Evo.
And that's the crazy thing, you know, about like the political landscape here in the U.S. And we have tons of folks who are pro-indigenous, but when it comes to defending indigenous leaders, they're nowhere to be found. Or they're pro-environment, but when it comes to defending governments that have defended the environment, as Ramiro so expertly shared in his Decolonizing Media, the recent episode, if you haven't caught it, definitely get on YouTube and watch that. You know, Bolivia has more trees per person than any other country in South America, right? Like, you know, they've, you know, cemented the rights of Pachamama and Mother Earth in its constitution during its Constituent Assembly, an effort Evo Morales led, right, to rewrite, you know, an ancient and archaic constitution written by Criollo elites. So it's you know, it's like so. Like we've said many times, it's this environmental imperialism where folks feel that it's only okay to defend indigenous people, to defend the environment when it's against a socialist government, right? And when it comes to defending, you know, the will and self-determination of indigenous people, as is occurring in Bolivia, crickets.
Yeah.
Like,
where you at?
Where you at?
Now's the time.
Now is the time.
Soviet U made a really good comment. Fascism is capitalism in decay, which is, I believe, a quote from Lenin, or correct me if I'm wrong, either Lenin or Stalin. And that's exactly right. The fascism that we see happening, not just in Bolivia, but all over the world, is an example of a system that no longer has a solution for people. Capitalism and neoliberalism do not bring prosperity. We see this in Haiti. We see this in Ecuador. Within just a few months of neoliberal austerity being imposed in Ecuador, you have infrastructure crumbling, people losing jobs, people going hungry, and their only response is with force and violence instead of addressing the underlying economic cause of capitalist crisis. And so this is a perfect example of why we need to not just fight fascism and capitalism in specific countries like Bolivia, but we need a worldwide continental revolution against this. And I think, for example, Ernesto Che Guevara, when he was in Bolivia, you'll recall that Ernesto Che Guevara was assassinated in Bolivia in the 60s because he was trying to build a revolutionary movement there with indigenous people, a militant armed revolutionary Marxist-Leninist guerrilla fight against the wealthy right Bolivian repressive state. And what Che Guevara said that Bolivia, the role that Bolivia and the Andes would play is that the Andes would be the Sierra Maestra of Latin America. Sierra Maestra was the mountain range in Cuba during the Cuban Revolution where the poorest campesinos, jibaros from Cuba lived and were part of the Cuban Revolution. And so using that model in a larger continental struggle of the Andes indigenous people, in Latin America, indigenous and black people are the most exploited in that region. And so this is a perfect example of how that sort of opening that Che Guevara envisioned is happening now.
Yeah, so again, thanks y'all so much for joining us. I don't think we've ever had this many people on the live. So
79, and it's Sunday night.
We're like 79,
I'm
we're like,
tired
woo, we're hype.
Yeah.
It's really exciting, you know, just to be here with y'all and you know, the U.S. is scared, honestly. Like, it is a time of hope. It is a time of change in Latin America and the Caribbean. You know, more and more folks are rising up. Not only, but let's think about like a recap of this year. Puerto Rico, right? Like getting rid of its governor and continuing, right? Like they're protesting now, students, right? Haiti, massive and continued protests against like neoliberalism and corruption in the country. You have Honduras. You have Panama, where students also, a lot of university students who are taking the helm of the anti-corruption, anti-neoliberalism protests in the country.
Panama.
In Panama, and then you have obviously Ecuador, where the betrayal of the citizens' revolution. Argentina, where the Peronistas were just re-elected. Lula was just released from Brazil, and this was after, right? Of course. Massive general strikes in Brazil. So shout out to our camaradas in Brazil. And
shout out to Brazil.
Some of us of y'all were joining us. And Chile, oh my goodness! Like I think looking at the coverage of the protests in Chile have just been so moving and so inspiring. We saw I remember I saw a photo of a young woman and her poster said, "Neoliberalism was born in Chile and will die in Chile." Or will return to die in Chile, something like that. And I thought that was just
beautiful, so
powerful, right? Like the historic nature of it, the kind of connection and the negation of the negation, right?
Yeah.
Like Latin America is at a time where we're just sick of this shit. We're sick of it. We're sick of capitalism. We're sick of imperialism, and because of everything that has gone on. The U.S. is scared of losing its grip on its backyard, as it has the custom to call us. And this is what's happening in Bolivia currently, where they're distorting a democratic process. And of course, there's a lot of chatter in the comments going on about how Bolivia needs to be full Marxist-Leninist and how it's
revolution or nothing.
Which from a theoretical dialectical point of view, of course we agree, right? Like we're a third worldist organization. Yeah. But I heard something on Telesur that I thought was really impactful, and it's like, even what you call a reform in Bolivia or Venezuela, right? It's profoundly anti-imperialist.
Exactly.
Because it has to be.
Mm-hmm.
So even these things that are, moving towards socialism, right? Like that is why Evo has called his party Movimiento al Socialismo, movement towards socialism, because we're just slowly trying to liberate ourselves from all these imperialist institutions and structures that were set up in our nation to make us, bend at the knee to the will of global capital. And that's a transition that doesn't take 13 years.
Right.
Right? So I think that's also important to not diminish, right, like a lot of what these social democratic popular movements have done in Latin America and the Caribbean, because at the end of the day, that's millions and millions of our people who have chosen to go about in that way. And we may disagree on the method, but at the end of the day, like what we want are the same things. But yes, of course, that leaves weak points, and this is exactly what happens in those moments. But at the end of the day, like I am confident, and I believe that the Bolivian people will reconsolidate, right, the revolutionary principles and movements, and we're just within a couple hours, like at this point, anything could happen. So we're
you gotta stay optimistic, because as communists, as revolutionaries, we have to stay optimistic, because we've gone through this before and we're gonna continue defeating it again. If you look at me and Ophelia were just watching a documentary yesterday about World War II, and there was a point where the Nazis were literally like a few miles away, 20 miles away from Moscow, where they could literally see the Kremlin. And so imagine if the Red Army at that point was like, fuck it, like, we're not going to do anything else. But they kept on fighting, they intensified, they mobilized the masses, and they waged people's war against the fascists. And that's what in Bolivia the people are doing now. I would highly suggest reading a document produced by Álvaro García Linera, the Vice President of Bolivia, published 2 years ago, in 2017, Reflections on the 100th Anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Read that. If you live in the US in the first world and you say, oh, Evo and Mas, they're not real socialists, they're not real communists, read that first. Hear it from them. Listen to them. It's racist to make a judgment about people, indigenous people, who are building socialism, fighting for the liberation, and not even paying attention to what they're putting out. Because they know about this stuff. They know about Lenin, they know about revolutionary socialism, and they have written about it. So take the time to actually read what they say. And Alvaro had a really great essay on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution that is literally being carried out now. That it's something that's, the lessons are being taking place today.
El Prince Capone said, the side against Evo are hardly Bolivians. If they were, they would be defending their sovereignty instead of groveling at the feet of the U.S. imperialists. They are descendants of the Spaniards. Yeah, absolutely. So if you're somewhat new to Latin America and the Caribbean, what we call criollos is essentially that, right? They're like your Donald Trumps of the world, right? Where we know the native peoples of these lands are indigenous and the oppressed and marginalized third world peoples that were forced to migrate to this country, like, you know, Latin Americans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, obviously black folks and chattel slavery and Chinese folks, right? Like, the elite of Bolivia and the folks calling and inciting violence is exactly that. They're the Spaniards that never left.
Yeah.
And they control a lot of the industry in the country, and, you know, are upset that Evo Morales has been in power in 13 years. A union leader, right? Like, we talk so much about, you know, a union leader, a socialist, a person, a cocalero, right? Like someone who grew coca, like of the land, indigenous, right? And I think also the second indigenous president in Latin America, the Caribbean, which is crazy. It's
ridiculous. Even though they're majority.
Even though that's the majority of the country, right? The first was Benito Juarez in Mexico, who was Zapotec, and then now Evo Morales. But it has taken us hundreds of years to even have like representation and leadership that looks and speaks for the majority of the country. So we definitely agree with that comment. Like, absolutely, like, these folks are like the Joanna Hausmans of the world, right? Like the Kat Von D's of the world, who I saw the other day being called Latina, which I thought was so gross. I'm like, just because you're born in a country,
they look German, white as fuck,
right? Like, it's just like, you're not, you know what I mean? Like, that's not the majority, that's not the people, and your nationality is one thing, but being of the people, being of the mass, being of the base, like, that's not the same thing. Right? And then this is what we're talking about. We're sitting here defending, you know, President Evo Morales and the Movimiento al Socialismo in Bolivia, indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and it's, you know, very clearly a coup attempt that's happening. My suspicion is that he has stepped down under duress, probably because, you know, someone was reporting that they kidnapped his sister, which I haven't confirmed, but I would totally believe that, right? Like, attempts against his life. And if y'all remember, about a year ago, when they were having the referendum in Bolivia to eliminate presidential terms, they made up this entire wealth of lies about himself and his personal life. And who did they do that to? Lula, right? Like, they did that to. They slandered and smeared him in national media, and just blatant lies. Come to find out that, you know, they were all lies, right? That greatly impacted, you know, the national dialogue and conversation about the referendum at the time.
It's like, for example, right, one of the major media outlets that has been completely bashing Evo Morales in Bolivia has been the New York Times. Well, who funds the New York Times? You have a lot of the oil companies, the Rockefellers, the wealthy East Coast oil elite, British Petroleum, BP in the UK, The Economist. All these institutions have been criticizing Evo. And it's interesting because the companies that own these media outlets, like the New York Times and The Economist, they're owned by ExxonMobil, BP, these multinational oil companies that do not want independent economies to create electric cars, to create lithium-powered cars like they were trying to do in Bolivia. And so it's all rooted in the economic base of capitalism and decay, imperialism and decay. And this is the context that we need to keep in mind, is that Bolivia presented an economic threat to the U.S. imperialist order because it's trying to go its own way. And this is just an example of why we need to understand it in the Marxist perspective. And I think for those of you who are watching this, I really, really urge you to please speak out, share this live, share, you know, we just posted a graphic on Anticonquista denouncing U.S. hands off Bolivia. Share that, because we have to keep in mind that this is U.S. orchestrated. The U.S. has its handprints, fingerprints all over this. The U.S. National Endowment for Democracy has been funding millions of dollars annually to so-called environmental groups in Bolivia to make their protest seem like a revolutionary movement. Israel has been financing evangelical movements in Bolivia against Evo. So it's our duty as people living in the US to say, US hands off Bolivia. Right now is not the time as communists to be like, you see, Evo's not a real socialist, Evo's not a real communist. In Bolivia, Mas is not a real socialist movement. No, that's not the time to do it, especially if you're white. If you're white, that is not your role right now. Your role is to defend the Bolivian people and Evo against this imperialist coup, because we're in the belly of the beast, we're in the empire. So that's our role to do here, from within, to protest this racist imperialist coup.
And I think maybe since you recently did that episode, you could share a little bit more of like the gains that Bolivia has made in the past 13 years, because I think it's like many of you, like we also are trying to be, you know, materialist about the situation, realistic about the situation, but at the end of the day, like even if it's unrealistic, we gotta stay hopeful. Like you gotta stay optimistic. You gotta say like, you know, and in any way, it's just in whatever happens, right? Like, you know, just like what's happening in Chile, just like what's happening in Brazil, like the people will recognize, you know, the grand failure of neoliberalism, of conservatism, of racism, and return to socialism. We will always return to socialism.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing that, as folks are mentioning, right, like Evo Morales is someone who is tireless.
Yeah.
He is tireless.
He puts in work.
A hard-working man. Like he will wake up at like 5 in the morning and go to sleep like at 11, 12 p.m. Like he, you know, has sacrificed blood, sweat, and tears for the people to build Bolivia into, you know, what it is now. And maybe then we can share a little bit more about that.
Right now, Bolivia has the fastest growing economy in Latin America. In 2018, Bolivia had the highest economic growth rate by GDP than any other Latin American country, right? And keep in mind, this is within the context of countries like Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, which historically have been the 4 largest economies in Latin America, with quadruple, you know, the population. Mm-hmm. And Bolivia has still advanced at a faster growth, economic growth. In Bolivia, you had malnutrition go down, you had literacy rates go up, people learning how to read and write. You also, in Bolivia, you had one of the best social security programs for the elderly, where people actually got checks from the state, older people, to allow them to continue to survive. A lot of campesinos in Bolivia, and the reason why a lot of people in the countryside support Evo is because in a lot of countries, for example, let's make 2 comparisons, right? Haiti and Bolivia. In Haiti, you have a very big issue of urbanization, where a lot of people in rural Haiti have been forced to leave the countryside because the US-backed government has prohibited farmers to grow their own industry. Oh, it froze? Huh, I wonder what happened. Yeah, it looks totally.
Oh, it's low battery.
Okay, so we should wrap up soon, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're back. Okay. If y'all can hear and see us okay, write yes in the chat so we can know.
Hey, sorry y'all.
Anti-imperialist streams always freeze, yo, for real. We can see you now. All right, cool. Welcome back, comrades. Yeah, shout out to everybody on here right now. Shout out to Caleb. Shout out to my homie Luis, Francisco Escobar, Clearwater, Tony, Nikki, Soviet U, Nathaniel. Shout out to all of y'all. We're talking about the imperialist racist coup taking place in Bolivia. And one of the things that we were just talking about is the great economic and social gains that have been made in Bolivia. So if you compare, for example, Haiti and Bolivia, which historically have been closest in terms of levels of poverty in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they have totally different routes. You have neoliberal capitalist Haiti, where people, I think it's over there, where people are literally dying of hunger. I was just in Haiti earlier this year, and you have a system where farmers are forced to leave the countryside and move to the capital, Port-au-Prince, to find jobs because they no longer can grow their own crops, and they're dependent on imports. So all these U.S. multinational companies are forcing farmers to import their seeds. You have Monsanto Bayer forcing them to import GMO seeds. Bolivia has banned GMO seeds. They do not allow GMO seeds. Bolivia and MAS has invested in allowing farmers and indigenous people to stay in their regions to stay in their locations, to grow their own food, grow their own crops, and not have to be dependent on imports from the imperialist countries. And so, again, it ties back to the whole capitalist crisis. Companies like Bayer, Monsanto, that create these horrible poisonous seeds, they need markets. They need markets to expand to. And because Bolivia has refused to do that, they will do anything, whatever it takes, to finance an imperialist coup. And so that's sort of the things that we got to keep in mind when we're talking about Bolivia. So Caleb Carmen said, your recent Bolivia video was amazing, appropriate time as well. Thank you, Caleb, for saying that. And Prince Capone said, you're right, but Evo has the benefit of all that historical experience. He should have known how to deal with the bourgeoisie. Now they're going to deal with him. Yes, but that's, again, it goes back to the point where it's not just a matter of having the right ideas. That's an idealist, non-Marxist way of thinking. It's not about the ideas that are in your head. Don't listen to what people are just saying. Look at what they're doing. Look at what they do in the real material world, right? It doesn't have to have a hammer and sickle for it to be communist. You don't have to, Evo is really bringing the means of production, the wealth of society, back to the working class people in a real material way. And in order to deal with an economy, to run a country, it's not as easy to just, wave a magic wand and be like, poof, you're gone. And I understand, a lot of leftists in the first world have that view, but it's a lot harder to govern. When you're actually governing a country, where every day you're subjected to attacks, it's hard to do that. And you have to prove to your base that it's not just about division and getting rid of, it's about building, it's about constructing. And sometimes that means building alliances with people who you don't want to build alliances with. And even ironically, a lot of people who call themselves Maoists, who critique Evo for not being radical enough or socialist enough, fail to understand that even Mao himself acknowledged this, that there are moments when you're faced with imperialist attack where you have to side with elements of the national bourgeoisie against imperialism. That's just basic, United Front communist ideology.
And thanks so much for, we literally did not think we could stay live for this long. We were going for like an hour, and it froze because we were running out of batteries, so I had to go run and find an extension. But yeah, as Ramiro was saying, like it's a moment where, of course, we believe like there's some tactical mistakes being made, but at the end of the day, like we're only a couple hours from the presumed resignation of the president. So I don't know. I feel like I'm gonna stay hopeful, and I feel like the context is very different than Venezuela, but at the end of the day, like the people are mighty, and we can't forget that.
Yeah. Don't doubt the Bolivian people. They know what works best for them, and it might not always be in line with what we think, but that's for them to decide, and that is the principled communist position to take. And in the first world, in the U.S., our job is, organize a protest in your area, even if it's just you. Spread the word, spread this link, spread our videos.
Someone asked if there are any other good Latinx leftist channels to support on YouTube. I don't know, let us know, because we'd like to find them. That's literally the reason why we started Anticonquista. We felt that there was not a space, there was not a platform that was, kind of sharing. There's a ton of sites. You get two kinds. Leftists from Latin American people, but those are mostly in Spanish. And then there's Latin American, either progressive-ish, or claiming to be left news sites that are primarily run by white people. We're just gonna be real with you, because we've worked with a lot of those folks. Like, we have seen what goes on behind, like, Upside Down World, for example. Like, we were able to see that, people are speaking for us. So at the end of the day, like, we, had to get our shit together, and both Ramiro and I have a lot of experience with media and communications, and we were just like, fuck it, let's
do our own
project. And that's exactly why we started Anticonquista. We are more than happy to support any other folks who are in the chat who want to start their own thing, want to contribute to Anticonquista, let us know. Someone also just asked, like, what is it and what is the primary difference between Bolivia and Venezuela? And again, like we were explaining, time is a big one, right? Like, the PSUV has been and the coalition has been in power for about 20 years. The leadership comes from the military, right? So, like, Hugo Chavez himself was able to build a base and movement in the traditional institution that helps the neoliberal right capitalists retain power in the country. Evo Morales was a different situation, right? Like that's not his base, that's not where he's from. Although he has tried through many different avenues, even creating an anti-imperialism school to try and, kind of rectify the armed forces in Bolivia. Obviously there's, we're now seeing in this time of crisis that they have turned against the Bolivian people, the leadership, right? Because there's still, opportunity for like the rank and file within the military to operate differently. Like for example, in Honduras, we never thought like that reactionary policing force would ever, but they did for a moment, right? Like turn against the government and refuse to shoot shoot or repress the people. The student protests that were going on right after Juan Orlando Hernandez was talking about fucking blatantly fraudulent election where he was not even allowed to run for a second term per U.S. Constitution. The same thing he accused Zelaya of, but then he did himself. But in any case, there's a big difference right there between Bolivia's military and policing forces versus Venezuela. Venezuela has also had time, right? Because Bolivia, besides maybe the Amazon stuff that kind of kicked up recently, has not had the same kind of mediatic attack and pressure that Venezuela has had. And so that has allowed Venezuela to, consolidate, right? A lot of revolutionary moral and work ethic in the country, and even build up the people's militias in the country. Like they've expanded those programs. So it's just like, subtleties like that. And in Nicaragua, for example, the Contras was not that long ago, right? And obviously Bolivia had a dictatorship too, but I think in Nicaragua that memory is very present.
Fresh,
It's very fresh for a lot of people. And I think once they saw people, and Contras themselves, because Contras never left Nicaragua, doing the same things, right, in 2019, they were like, oh, hell no, right? And they reacted accordingly. And I do think it was a tactical mistake for Evo to call the people to calm and peace, because the right doesn't recognize that, right? Like the right is not going to acknowledge any type of semblance of order or peace or rule of law. They just want to wreak as much chaos and havoc as they can to take power by whatever means they can.
That's a really good point, because if you notice, they also punch their own. Like what the U.S. imperialism wants is chaos, right? They want destruction. They want U.S. markets to dominate. So if you notice with the protests in Chile, they weren't really afraid to hit Piñera, Sebastián Piñera, who's the president of Chile. They weren't afraid to like give him a few hits, right? To be like, oh, there's a crisis in Chile. But what they're more concerned about is giving hard hits to socialist and anti-imperialist leaders who are creating an independent economy. Because at the end of the day, as long as that is taken care of, as long as there's chaos in Bolivia and Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, they win. They don't care who takes charge. As long as chaos remains, they win, because they profit off of that chaos. And so that is the context we have to keep in mind. Also, Bolivia is landlocked. Bolivia doesn't have access to sea markets as well as other countries do. So that's also another disadvantage that they have in terms of building their economy. And again, remember that this is all based on the context of the US-China trade war. One of the biggest issues in the trade war has been rare earth minerals. Because China is increasing its tariffs on US products, and vice versa, US companies have less access to rare earth minerals that are available in places like Bolivia. And so by overthrowing Evo, all of those state-run, publicly run, nationalized means of production, like lithium, iron ore, etc., now all these US multinational companies will gain access to those resources and the market, so that now US companies can come in, own those mines, own those salt mines, salt reserves, and sell it back to people in Bolivia, even though it's in their country. That's the model of capitalism. This is what it's about, and we have to understand it within that context.
And I want to share for folks who are in Philly, PSL is having a rally tomorrow 4 to 6 at City Hall, if y'all can make it. If there's any other events you want people to know of or shout out, like let us know. We've just been keeping up with the news, so we haven't seen if there's anything US based that people are calling other folks to action, but you're definitely welcome to throw it in the comments and we'll shout it out. I think that's another important piece, right? Like I think we know our strength is media, we know our strength is video production, writing, and that's our contribution, right?
Yeah.
Like And I think if there's, other folks like, doing any types of mobilization, like please let us know.
Yeah, go out to those protests. Share the stuff. Share U.S. out of Bolivia. This is a U.S. created problem, okay? This is a problem that is rooted in U.S. imperialism. And we have to keep framing it in that way. And we have work to do here. We can't just sit idly by and be like, oh, you're not socialist enough, so that's why you deserve to. No, like that's not the time for this.
Someone mentioned that what did we think on the Bolivian military? We shared a little bit about that, right? The historic and institutional differences between there and Venezuela, which I think is the most relevant example. Do you think the purges against the army high command following 2000 coup is the key difference? I mean, yeah, like we were mentioning, right? Like Venezuela has had a history of attack against its, much more kind of aggressive socialist PSUV and coalition there in the country. I mean, everyone's like, well, Venezuela's not socialist yet. I mean, like, it basically is, right? Like, we can even acknowledge that, like, just dialectically and through Marxism-Leninism, like, the state controls, like, the key industries in the country, right? Like, they are able to give people, like, fundamental needs, like housing and food and jobs and education, like, it's state control, like state-centered and state-centered planned economy, right? And that's, in our eyes, that's socialism, right? So whether you do it through like bourgeois democracy, I mean, that's on you, but that's what we believe in. Yeah, I think because Venezuela has had to have and has been attacked so many, much like Cuba, right? Because Cuba has like suffered a constant barrage under the embargo and the blockade of the U.S. Like, they've been able to like reconsolidate, right? Like, and be able to like reinvigorate the revolutionary process, because it's a process, right? It's not, from here to, you'll talk to some certain parties or communists and they think, no, nothing but revolution. Like, damn, bro, really? Like, you don't even act like that in your day-to-day life.
Meanwhile, those people will be the same ones who will be like, Bernie 2020, and it's like, they have these like unrealistic radical expectations for people in the third world, but then when it comes to domestic U.S. politics, they'll take whatever concession they can get.
Yeah, and someone asked us about Kirchnerismo or Peronismo. Of course, like I have a lot of criticism of Peronismo, specifically just historically Peron himself, like sheltering Nazis, and that was whack. No one's ever gonna be like, yeah, that was great. Remember when we sheltered Nazis? No. But at the end of the day, and I'm going to reiterate the same point that I heard on Telesur today, because it's something I swear to God, I tell Ramiro all the time. And I say, when Latin America, when third world peoples in the Caribbean, when marginalized and oppressed peoples do things like create state-controlled industries, do things like renegotiate or reject neoliberalism contracts with the IMF that impose austerity, like, even if it's quote-unquote reformist to the eyes of you, perfect 100% authentic Marxist-Leninist, like, it's anti-imperialist. It threatens the power and grip of the hegemon, which is the United States. And that's why even those social democratic, kind of progressive governments that we're very supportive of or critically supportive of at times, right, are so important, right? Like, those alternatives are important to bolster and continue to build the masses and the millions of people that exist in Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically for anti-conquista, is what we're talking about, but the rest of the world as well. So I think that's our stance on it, right? Like, of course, I mean, I'm not gonna, it's complicated. It's complicated, and we had a great conversation when Kayla was here actually about like the way the left looks now is very. It's weird. Like, it's just like kind of, you'll have some very like theology-based kind of leftisms. You'll have some more secular leftisms. It's just
it's
it
different
really
from
runs
the 20th
the gamut.
century.
Yeah, it really runs the gamut, and I think it's I don't want to say dogmatic, but we want to be open to taking what works and leaving what doesn't.
We have to adapt our ideas to the current material reality, not the other way around. We can't be like, oh, well, it doesn't conform to my 20th century understanding of socialism versus capitalism, so I'm not going to support either. That's a very idealist and non-Marxist way of understanding the world. Because, for example, look at Iran, right? Iran, they openly said from the Islamic Revolution in 1979, neither capitalism nor socialism, but Islam. But if you look at Iran's economy, there's elements of socialism. They don't have usury in the banks because it's against Islam. They have state industries that redistribute wealth back to the people. They have women in politics. And there's different elements of socialism that exist within it, even though they're socially conservative. But even then, even though it's not calling itself socialist or 100% the revolutionary Marxist, even though they're not saying that, they're still objectively presenting a challenge to the expansion of capital in that market. And that's why they're a threat. And so that's just kind of same thing with Bolivia. Is like, even though they're building their own system that's not exactly 100% pure Marxism or whatever, it's still a challenge to capitalism and
Yes, but what if girls said imperialism is a primary contradiction, anti-imperialism is profoundly revolutionary? Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And that's generally the stance we take as anti-popista. Like if you follow our pages and our material and the things we produce, like we're in support of Iran, we're in support of the DPRK, we're in support of Venezuela, we're in support of Nicaragua. Like, of course, we think a lot of things can get better. In particular for myself, I have certain, frustrations about, certain social issues, gender issues, LGBTQ issues. Yeah, absolutely. But, it's anti-imperialism, and it's there's already like, and let's not diminish the kind of internal agitations that are going to move the revolution to a place that is more left, which is already happening, right? Like, queer folks in Nicaragua, or, women in Venezuela fighting for abortion rights. Like, absolutely, that is already happening, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here on my high horse and be like, well, because the U.S. has, you know what I mean? Like, that's nonsensical, right? There's already folks pushing and fighting for that, and there's a lot that, it's a process. It's a revolutionary process, and people are front and center in that process, and they're continuing to agitate for moving the project further left, just like with Bolivia, right? And it's that kind of space and that kind of room for that experimentation and growth and trial and error that we're advocating, that we're protecting, that we're fighting for, that is ultimately like the most dialectical thing I think we can do from here, from the U.S., right? Like, I'm not in Bolivia, and I think that's like of the utmost importance for us to, next time your friend starts trash talking how everything is reformist, and I'm like, okay, cool, you tell me when you lead a country of 2 billion people, what the fuck you're gonna do? Like, I think things like that just irk me, because so many of those people just don't do anything. They're at their computer, they're on fucking Reddit, or whatever channel they're on, and they're just like, blah, blah, blah,
not real socialists. Like, who the fuck are you?
Okay, all right, great. Like, how did that help us in any way? Like, even if, like, let's have a discussion about it, right? Like, somebody mentioned that the PRC failing to be more supportive of the third world, like the Soviet Union served that role while they were around, and we agree. Like, there's been, like, and from folks we know who are out in China, they say that that's kind of like, they want to continue to build and are not, are interested in doing, things like Bricks and Road, the Silk Road, the new Silk Road, BRICS, right? Like, they are doing things that are profoundly in solidarity, right? But I think, and then you look at Russia, which has done way more in terms of like hard power to, support, Syria or wherever it may be, even Venezuela, giving them fighter planes, but Russia's not necessarily, is not ruled by socialists. Right. So it's just like little things like that you're just like, okay, well, there are contradictions. There's fucking contradictions. We, communist socialists, we write about contradiction. So why are you all surprised when it happens?
Yeah. Building socialism is not an on-off switch. It's like a dial. And we have to understand that's dialectical thinking. It's not a binary of like capitalism, socialism. It's a dial and it's a process. There's quantity into quality. When you have quantitative change in the redistribution of wealth under capitalism, you have a qualitative change in the mode of production, which leads into socialism. It can't be built overnight. You can't wave a magic wand and be like, I hereby declare this to be a socialist economy. No, it takes a long time. And even the Soviet Union, for example, with the new economic policy, the first 10 years of the Soviet Union, in 1919 to 1929, you had the new economic policy where actually Lenin said, no, we're actually going to have loans to local businesses and industries to build. They needed to temporarily build the market to develop the forces of production.
And that's the other thing to remember about a place like Bolivia and just the third world in general. they've been underdeveloped by capitalism and imperialism. They have not been allowed to even build like a bourgeoisie or even build national industry in the country, because so much of that has literally been controlled, built, mined, extracted, refined by U.S. companies and multinational companies. And I think that that's exactly like part of like our critique of the anti-extractivism movements in Ecuador and Bolivia. Like, yes, of course, objectively, we understand that we don't want to be extracting minerals or oil, but Bolivia is totally dependent on that. And that's why it needs that. But while we're doing it, why not use that to build education in the country, to end illiteracy, to end extreme poverty, to allow everyone to have access to healthcare, to build social housing. This is what is at stake in Bolivia. This is what is at stake, is a revolutionary process and progress. And that's what we're here standing for. That's what we're here hopefully giving y'all some more information about, because it's absolutely crucial that even in a place like Bolivia that we defend all the gains without question when it's under threat of a military coup, right? Like, we can have our poems and our arguments once we return back to kind of stable situation in the country, but as it stands literally right now, we need to do everything in our power to stand with Bolivia. And if that means sharing something, talking to your friends, coming out, even if you don't jive with the party who's hosting it, who cares? Come out, participate. This is why we decided last minute on watching the coverage, and I was feeling so sad. I know you saw in the comments, some folks were saying you've been crying. Like,
that shit is hard.
It's hard. It's hard to deal with all that. I was on a high note on Friday when they released Lula. I was so happy. There were people in the street clamoring just to touch his arm, just to talk to him. And I thought that was so beautiful. And they had certified the election in Bolivia, and I was so excited about that. And then this hits. And we were like, you know what? Let's just direct our energy somewhere, right? Like, let's, put up a live. Let's, do something where we can, like, in community, like, talk about what's going on in a space that, we feel is helpful as much as we can be to what's happening in Bolivia. And let us know if you have any questions, any comments. We've been going.
If there's any actions, remember to put in the chat. If there's any protests or actions going on in your area, let us know so we can shout it out. It's important that we get people out there voicing what's going on. But it's really insane. It's very upsetting. I remember the coup in Honduras in 2009. That was actually one of the moments where I became politicized because of the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and the Democrats carried out against Manuel Zelaya. And it was horrible. You look at what happens to countries after coups, it's not a joke. It's very serious shit that goes on after coups happen. In Honduras, after the US-backed coup, you have a right-wing neoliberal government that has killed hundreds of activists, including Berta Cáceres and Margarita Murillo. You have neoliberal austerity, the cutting of schools, money for jobs. You have rampant unemployment. In Honduras, because so many of the state jobs that existed under Zelaya were cut, people became unemployed, and the only jobs they could get were shitty minimum wage jobs at like Friendly's or McDonald's or whatever U.S. company that they were able to bring wages so low that people can't even afford to survive. And so they turn to things like gangs, they turn to things like crime because there's no other option. And I wouldn't be surprised that in Bolivia there are forces connected to drugs, to the drug industry, that want to bring control over the coca farms back to drug cartels and to make people dependent on drugs. Again, the way that the British did in China with the opium wars, where the British grew opium in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and sold it to China to have a whole market of people dependent on their drugs. And this is what it comes down to. The US imperialist system, the fascists, they want to wipe out indigenous people. They want to steal their resources. They want to steal what they can and wipe them out. This is not a secret. This is open. And you have fascist Nazis who were part of the Bolivian Operation Condor in Bolivia in the military, who did experiments on indigenous people, who killed indigenous people. this is a race and class war against an oppressed working class indigenous people. This is what we have to keep in mind. And right now, as we speak, there are people being attacked in Bolivia simply for just being indigenous, because the white settlers in Bolivia will suspect them of supporting Evo, which in a lot of cases they do, obviously, and they're being targeted and killed just for that. So, you know, when the people who are against racism and against fascism in the U.S., you know, turn your attention to Bolivia, because right now is a scary time to be leftist or indigenous in Bolivia. I would be shitting my pants right now if I was in Bolivia, if I was indigenous, because of these fascist attacks on the people. So it's really scary, and I think it's important that we're here, we're all talking, we're all in this chat. Shout out to Colin, shout out to Soviet U, shout out
to anarcho-syndicalist getting that bread who's in LA. We should meet up, we're in LA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what else have folks been saying? Like, yeah, this isn't the time for critical support. The decision is, you know, social democracy, progress, self-determination for indigenous peoples in Bolivia, or fascism.
Yeah.
There's no
magical third,
well, there's no
magical
right
Maoist movement that comes from the mist. And this is what we have to deal with now.
Yeah.
And there's a side. Are you gonna take the side of the fascists
or the people?
Or the people? And not taking a side is taking a side, by the way. Absolutely. So being like, oh, there's no good guys in this situation. No, that's cowardice. That's a cowardly position to take.
And someone asked, oh, I told my family about it, but what can we do? I think the biggest thing we can do, especially in the US, stop watching Univision, stop watching Telemundo. It's absolute trash. Jorge Ramos is trash. Everyone in that runs those major news Spanish language media companies, like, you know, it's very evident. Like, well, here's the weird thing, right? Because domestically they do a lot of good things, right, about informing different things in the immigrant community. But when it comes to like international pieces and stories, like, it's just completely parroting, you know, right-wing media news outlets. There's nothing different. So I think, you know, don't overwhelm yourself also thinking you need to lead a revolution to Bolivia right now.
Yeah.
Like, that's just unrealistic,
Yeah.
you know? Continue to not just share anti-conquista stuff, that's good. But, you know, get them, you know, do whatever you can to like inform people, communicate with them. And, you know, my mom is like 56 years old, and I talk to her about things like this. I never, you know, presume that she can't understand, like, as a campesina woman from Mexico, like, understand like what is at stake in countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, and I always try and keep, you know, communicate with her as much as I can, and I think that's part of it, you know, like we're doing that. We're, you know, trying to support, or if you know an organization in Bolivia, like send funds to them.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the best thing we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, obviously we think our part is anti-conquista, is, you know, becoming a part of this project. And so if you're interested in becoming a part of the project and you know, contributing video, resources, whatever it is, hit us up. Like, you're more than welcome. Somos pocos pero locos, you know? Like,
yeah, for real.
There's a small contingent of us, and we're more than happy to grow and bring more folks onto anti-conquista, and want to continue to grow the media collective. And as we know, there's already such a shutout of alternative news media on Bolivia. Like, to begin with, you're not going to find anything on mainstream media except, oh, he stepped down, he's a dictator, woo-hoo, yay, democracy in Bolivia. Woo. Literally, that's the story. You can open up any major newspaper right now, any website, without a doubt, I can tell you that's probably the title of their next article.
Exactly.
Of their article. No context, no understanding, no recognition of the work that MAS has done in the country, Movimiento al Socialismo, Bolivia's ruling party. None of that. So I think part of it is being able to contribute to projects like Anticonquista, to be able to support projects like ours, like Resumen Inglés, like Telesur English, like all the folks that, you know, we're working arduously. Us, for example, nobody pays us to do this.
Yeah, we don't get paid to do it.
You know, we do this like because it's a labor of love for the people. It's our revolutionary responsibility to do this. And I think, you know, we try as much as we can to support wherever we can and disseminate, right, a lot of these, because we both speak Spanish, and we can, you know, look at Spanish news sources acutely and understand like what's really going on in the country, and then share that in English with y'all. I think that has been our primary role throughout all of this, and bringing more Latinx folks to the left, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's there's already that nascent seed of like leftism within any like immigrant, you know, community here in the U.S. and it's just growing and developing that so that we don't lose people to liberalism. We lose so many people to liberalism.
Yeah. It's all hot Cheetos and fucking and minerals and.
Hey, I don't know why he's not hot Cheetos.
I like hot Cheetos too.
I know
but when like you see all these sites like Mi Tour and Mezcla, it's all like.
Yeah. Like that kind of very cursory, cultural, honestly caricature. And if they do get political, it's usually horrible. So I don't want to talk about that. But majority of the coverage is like consume ethnic things that make you feel Latinx. And I'm just like, I don't know.
So Infinita Salo said, an opposition lawmaker's interim president. I think there might be a civil war. So you know, let us know what's going on.
So no, it's not military rule. What happened was that the military and the federal police asked Evo Morales to step down in a declaration. He resigned, as did his vice president, which made also him ineligible to continue to carry Morales' mandate. Mind you, he's president until January 2020. That would be the end of his term. The next person in line would be the president of the National Assembly, the Asamblea Nacional, their Congress. She also stepped down because they're all MAS members, right? They're all under incredible duress and threats against their families and their own lives. And so then the vice president, who is of the right wing,
Jeanette Agnes.
Correct, Jeanette Agnes.
Janine Agnes.
Janine Agnes is currently, I guess, president, interim president of Bolivia. And someone made a very astute comment saying, oh, they're going to use this woman, right, this right-wing woman to prop up Bolivia's right-wing fascists as like progressive and great for women. And, you know, it's
the
great.
Glass ceiling.
No, wait, but like it's great for the optics, right? And that's what Venezuela has been so good at informing people about regime change, about mediatic regime change, about how they use media and modern communications. And don't think that this was by chance, like, at all, like, not thought about. Like, this is strategic, and they're gonna act like, and I forgot who it was in the comments, but that was a great comment, who said that they're gonna act like this is great for women, but in reality, it's all their policies are gonna roll back what has already been instrumental and great for women. And for example, if you can't, we also shared a few weeks ago on Redfish Stream, one of our comrades, Alka, who's out in the UK, who's Bolivian, she went to visit Bolivia and to discuss the situation of women in Bolivia. And one of the things that was, you know, a big highlight of their visit there was that women are learning, quote unquote, traditional men's jobs, right, in the country. They're learning how to build houses, they're learning how to be electricians, they're learning how to, you know, operate buses. They're learning how to do all of these things in the country that before were thought of as inaccessible to women. And that has been deliberate, because if it's not deliberate, it would never happen. It has been through programs run through MAS and the progressive governance there that, you know, women's rights and equality have been, of course there has also been, you know, femicides and, you know, tons of those issues in Bolivia, but at the end of the day, like, women are also gaining in terms of equality and gender rights in the country. So I think that's another huge one that's at stake in the country.
Greatest Ever asked, what socialist music artists do you guys listen to?
Oh. English or in Spanish though, because that's kind of, there's a lot in Spanish in terms of like Nueva Canción, Philip Ayun, Inti Limani, Victor Jara, Violeta Parra, that's all Chile, Carlos Mejía Godoy, Luis Mejía Godoy, Los Guaraguao, Ali Primera,
yeah.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
Silvio Rodriguez, Carlos Puebla.
Raging Moral Technique, yep, I fucks with Moral Technique. Raging Against the Machine, yeah.
Ana Tijoux, who's rap artist.
Rebel Diaz, yeah. Shout out to Rebel Diaz, by the way. Love Rebel Diaz. We're good fans of them, good friends. But yeah, thank you all for tuning in. I think we should wrap it up. It's getting kind of late, but
yeah, thank you so much for joining us. The live will be up, so you know, go ahead, share this with your comrades, your friends. Follow us at Anticonquista. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, obviously YouTube, and if you can, throw some coins our way, like we mentioned, we don't get paid for this work. It's our, revolutionary work and ethic, and we use all the money we get. We don't, make banners, and we pay for this ourselves. Okay, so we don't create leaflets or flyers. We put everything back into the people. We try and send it to organizations that are putting in work, like the Haiti Solidarity Action Center, right?
The Haiti Action Committee.
The Haiti Action Committee, who's doing great work, tied with Lavalas in Haiti. And as you know, they've been protesting literally the whole year and the whole past year too. Ramiro, had the chance to visit Haiti and see everything firsthand. So we sent money to those folks, money to Movimiento al out of Puerto Rico. We try and be diligent about what we need to spend money on and what we don't. We try and send to organizations that are just putting in work for the people, primarily in Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank y'all so much. We're at patreon.com/anticonquista. And
shout out to Alex, Nikki, shout out to Kayla, Joe the Red, to Luis Nicho. We love all of y'all, and peace out. Hope you have a great night. And thanks again for tuning in. We really appreciate this, and we will hopefully try to do more streams like this. Share the link, oppose the racist imperialist coup, spread the message.
And keep hope alive, y'all.
And keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
Anything when we thought Chavez was down in the dumps and it was a wrap, and the people clamored the presidential the Miraflores Palace until they brought him back out, and they couldn't find a single person to carry out the coup. We're hopeful.
Venceremos, like the song goes.
Thanks,
Peace out, y'all.